Every country on Earth is drowning in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. Globally, the number has exploded to over $300 trillion, 3 times the size of the entire world economy. But here's the part that makes no sense. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? Who sits on the other side of the balance sheet? When you trace the flow of debt, when you follow where the money really goes, you find something that feels almost impossible. The world doesn't owe money to any one nation or person. It owes money to itself. And that's not an accident. Because centuries ago, a few men quietly designed a system that traps every government, every citizen, and every future generation in permanent debt. A system that can never be paid off because it isn't meant to be. This isn't conspiracy. It's documented history. Their names are rarely mentioned in school books, yet their decisions built the financial world we live in today. And once you see how they did it, you'll realize that $38 trillion isn't a problem to fix. It's the system working exactly as designed. So let's start at the beginning, with the man who turned borrowing into an endless loop. Before 1694, kings borrowed money the old-fashioned way. They would approach merchants or wealthy nobles, promise repayment with interest, and hope for the best. If they couldn't pay, they defaulted. Creditors lost money. Kings borrowed from someone else. The system reset itself, messy but temporary. Debt had an end, either repayment or collapse. Then came William Paterson, a Scottish merchant who changed everything. England was at war with France, and King William III was desperate for funds. The treasury was empty, taxes couldn't cover the cost, and lenders refused new loans because England had defaulted before. That's when Patterson made a proposal that would rewrite financial history. He offered to organize a group of wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million, a massive sum at the time. But there was one condition. The loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay interest forever, 8% every year. To manage this deal, Patterson suggested creating a new institution, the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. Merchants would deposit their gold into the bank. The bank would lend that money to the government. The government would pay interest using tax revenue, and the bank would distribute that interest to the merchants. But the principal, the original $1.2 million, would never be returned. Why would anyone agree to this? Because the interest was guaranteed by Parliament and backed by the power to tax. As long as the English people could be taxed, the payments would never stop. Even better, the merchants could trade their notes as money. Those notes paid interest and were safer than gold itself. It was genius and dangerous. For the first time, national debt became permanent. It was no longer a temporary burden to be repaid. It became a feature of the system, the foundation of modern finance. From that moment on, government debt was no longer a problem. It was an asset. And Patterson's real stroke of brilliance was still to come. He gave the Bank of England the right to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt. This meant debt itself could create money. The government's IOU became the foundation of the currency. The more it borrowed, the more money could exist. If you were a banker, this was paradise. If you were a taxpayer, it was a trap. Because from that day forward, your taxes weren't just funding wars or infrastructure. They were paying interest on a debt that would never disappear. Within decades, France, the Netherlands, and later the United States copied the same model. A new world was born, one built on permanent debt. But this was only the first architect. The next man wouldn't just keep the debt permanent, he would make it global. By the early 1800s, Europe was hooked on debt. Governments borrowed endlessly for wars, railways, and expansion, but every deal was local and chaotic. There was no unified market, no system that connected all this borrowing together. Then came Nathan Rothschild, the man who turned debt into a global industry. The Rothschild family began as small money changers in Frankfurt. But Nathan had something his rivals didn't: vision and a network. By 1800, the 5 Rothschild brothers had branches in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. They could move gold, letters, and intelligence across borders faster than any government could. And Nathan realized that this network could be used to control the one thing every country needed: money. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain needed vast sums to fight France. Nathan didn't just lend the money directly, he invented a new system, buying British government bonds at a discount and reselling them to investors at a markup. He made his profit in the middle while creating a brand new secondary market. Now, governments got cash instantly, investors got bonds they could trade, and Rothschild got control over the flow. But his most famous move came in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. When Napoleon was defeated, Nathan's private couriers brought the news to London before anyone else. Armed with that knowledge, he sold British bonds, tricking others into thinking Britain had lost. Panic spread. Prices crashed. Then he quietly bought everything back at rock-bottom prices. When the official news of victory hit, those bonds skyrocketed. Rothschild made millions in a single day, not by cheating, but by mastering the flow of information. After that, no one could compete. By the 1820s, the Rothschild network dominated Europe's sovereign debt. Any government that wanted to borrow had to go through them. They didn't just lend money, they set the rules. They decided interest rates. They decided who was creditworthy. And by connecting all the debts together, they made default almost impossible. Here's how. A British bond might be owned by a French investor, sold to a German bank, and used as collateral for a loan to an Austrian noble. It was one web. If a single country defaulted, it wasn't just one nation in trouble, it was the entire system. That was the Rothschild innovation. Make debt so interconnected that no one could escape it without bringing everyone else down. By mid-century, the Rothschilds were the richest family in the world. Richer than kings, more powerful than governments. And their empire was built not on factories, ships, or armies, but on interest. The more nations borrowed, the more the family profited. The trap Patterson built in 1694 was now global. Every government was inside it, feeding it, expanding it. But there was still one flaw. Governments could only borrow as much gold as existed in their vaults. There was still a ceiling, a limit to the illusion. And one man would remove that limit completely. He would make debt infinite. By the dawn of the 20th century, America had become the new center of global wealth. But its financial system was still primitive and unstable. Banks were scattered, money was tied to gold, and every few years a panic would shake the economy. Then, in 1907, the system nearly collapsed. Stock prices crashed, banks failed. Ordinary people lined up to pull their savings before everything disappeared. And when the government froze, one man stepped in. His name was J.P. Morgan. At 70 years old, Morgan was already the most powerful banker in the United States. During the panic, he gathered New York's top financiers in his private library, locked the doors, and refused to let anyone leave until they pledged enough money to save the system. By sheer force of will, Morgan stopped the collapse. The markets recovered, and he became a national hero. But behind that success, Morgan saw something bigger. He realized that a single person couldn't save the system every time. America needed a permanent mechanism, one that could create money when it was needed most. And that idea would change everything. In 1910, Morgan's closest associates, including Senator Nelson Aldrich, met secretly on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days in total secrecy, they designed what would become the Federal Reserve System. The plan was brilliant because it was disguised. Americans hated central banks. They had already destroyed 2 of them. So instead of calling it a central bank, they gave it a friendly name, the Federal Reserve. Instead of one powerful institution, it would have 12 regional banks. Instead of admitting that private bankers would run it, they added a board of governors appointed by the president to make it look public. But underneath the design, the control still belonged to the bankers. The regional Federal Reserve banks were owned by member banks, the same private institutions the system was supposed to regulate, and the New York Fed, controlled by Morgan's allies, held the real power, the ability to create money. Here's how it worked. When the government needed funds, it could issue bonds. The Federal Reserve would buy those bonds using money it simply created. That newly created money entered the economy. The government spent it, and the bonds, the debt, sat on the Fed's balance sheet. Debt had now become the source of money itself. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a limit to how much the government could borrow. After it, there was no limit at all. The system guaranteed that there would always be demand for debt because the Fed could always create money to buy it. It was the perfect feedback loop, infinite borrowing backed by infinite money. When Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, most representatives had no idea what they were approving. But within months, the United States government could issue endless debt without worrying about gold or market demand. Taxes would pay the interest, and the printing press would take care of the rest. That was the moment debt became infinite. And for the bankers who designed it, the profits became infinite too. J.P. Morgan died the same year the Federal Reserve was born. But his creation outlived him, shaping every crisis, every boom, and every bailout that followed. The trap Patterson had built and Rothschild had globalized was now self-sustaining, and soon another man would make sure no one, not even an entire country, could ever escape it. By the late 1970s, the debt machine was running smoothly, but it was reaching its limits. Inflation in the United States had exploded past 10%. The dollar was losing credibility, and the world's faith in the system was starting to crack. That's when one man stepped in to preserve it, Paul Volcker. Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979. He knew that if inflation kept rising, the dollar would collapse, and with it, the global financial order. So he made a brutal decision. He raised interest rates higher than any central banker ever had before, from 11% to 20%. The goal was to crush inflation. It worked, but the side effects were devastating. In the 1970s, developing countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed heavily in U.S. dollars when rates were low. They had used those loans to build infrastructure and grow their economies. But when Volcker's rate hikes hit, their interest payments tripled overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $60 billion. Argentina, $40. Suddenly, they couldn't even pay the interest, let alone the principal. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make its next payment. That single statement sent shockwaves across the world. If Mexico defaulted, America's largest banks, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, would take catastrophic losses. The entire financial system was at risk. Volcker had a choice. Let the system reset or save it by trapping these countries inside the loop forever. He chose the second option. Working with the International Monetary Fund, Volcker arranged a series of rescue loans. But they weren't rescues, they were shackles. The IMF would lend Mexico and other nations enough money to keep making their interest payments to U.S. banks. In return, those countries had to accept harsh conditions known as structural adjustments. They were forced to cut public spending, privatize state-owned companies, and open their markets to foreign investors. They had to devalue their currencies, dismantle protections, and surrender large parts of their economic sovereignty. They didn't get out of debt. They just got new debt to keep paying the old one. It was the perfect fix for the bankers. The money kept flowing upward. The interest never stopped. Volcker's model became the new global template. Whenever a country couldn't pay, it wasn't allowed to default. It was refinanced through the IMF, the World Bank, or other institutions, with terms that guaranteed one thing: continued interest payments. Debt was no longer just permanent or infinite. It was now inescapable. Decades later, the same pattern repeated in Greece, Argentina, Sri Lanka, and dozens of others. Each time, the script stayed the same. A crisis, a bailout, and a lifetime of repayments. Every bailout was really just a buyout of sovereignty, of independence, of the future. Volcker left office in 1987, celebrated for saving the dollar, but what he really did was lock the entire world inside the system forever. The machine could no longer fail because no one was allowed to leave it. Next, we'll look at what this machine has become today, a global structure so massive and interconnected that even trying to escape would bring everything down. By the 2000s, the system that Paterson built, Rothschild expanded, Morgan perfected, and Volcker secured had become unstoppable. Debt was no longer a symptom of crisis. It was the foundation of the global economy. Every country borrowed. Every corporation borrowed. Every household borrowed. The world now runs on debt the way the body runs on blood. Today, global debt has reached over $315 trillion. That's more than 3 times the size of the entire global economy. It's a number so large that no one even expects it to be repaid. And that's the secret. It's not supposed to be. Because this isn't debt anymore. It's money. In the United States alone, the government owes $38 trillion. Roughly half of that debt is owned by American institutions, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and the Federal Reserve itself. These entities buy government bonds because they're considered safe. But safe doesn't mean free. Those bonds pay about $1 trillion in interest every year. That money comes from taxpayers. It's a silent transfer, from the labor of millions to the balance sheets of the wealthy. The other half of U.S. debt is owed internally to programs like Social Security and Medicare. The government borrowed their surplus funds and spent them long ago. So now, when those programs need the money, the government must either raise taxes or borrow even more. It's a circular system. Money moving in loops, never settling, never ending. And it's not just America. Japan owes $9 trillion, mostly to its own central bank. Europe owes $14 trillion, financed by the European Central Bank. China owes trillions to itself through its state-run banks. Each region is using the same design, borrowing endlessly, rolling over old debt with new debt, and treating interest payments as a permanent expense. But here's the real trick. Every one of these debts is connected. Japan owns U.S. treasuries. The U.S. owns European debt through the IMF. Europe funds developing nations through the World Bank. It's a global circle of obligations where everyone owes everyone else. And that means if one domino falls, they all fall. Default isn't just dangerous anymore, it's unthinkable. That's why governments don't even talk about paying off their debt. If the United States actually paid its $38 trillion, the money supply would collapse overnight. Because dollars are created when the government borrows. If the debt disappeared, so would most of the dollars in existence. Trade would freeze, banks would fail, the economy would die. Debt is the lifeblood of the modern system. It must grow, or everything stops. So governments keep borrowing. The interest keeps flowing. And the beneficiaries are the same powerful institutions that sit quietly behind it all. Asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity. They control tens of trillions in client assets, including massive holdings of government bonds. Every year, they collect billions in interest, money that comes straight from taxpayers around the world. It's the largest wealth transfer in human history, invisible to most people because it doesn't look like theft. It's just called debt service. This is the modern trap, a system so large and so interconnected that even those who see it have no way out. Because ending it would mean ending the global economy itself. But how did it all come to this? How could one idea from the 1600s evolve into a structure that rules the entire planet? To understand that, we have to look back at the 4 architects who built it, and how each one handed his design to the next. Across 3 centuries, 4 men built a system so vast that it now defines every nation on Earth. They didn't know each other, yet each picked up where the last one left off, perfecting a design that would trap the world in perpetual motion. It wasn't one plan, but a chain of ideas that linked seamlessly across time. William Patterson began it all in 1694. He made debt permanent. For the first time in history, a government borrowed money it would never repay. Instead, it promised interest forever, a small detail that quietly rewired the entire economy. What started as a war loan became the foundation of modern banking. A century later, Nathan Rothschild made that foundation global. He turned national debts into tradable assets, spreading them across borders until every default threatened everyone else. He didn't just lend money, he controlled the flow of it. by making debt universal, he made it unbreakable. Then came J.P. Morgan. He made debt infinite. By creating the Federal Reserve, he gave governments the power to borrow without limit. Money was no longer tied to gold or production. It was tied to belief. As long as the world trusted paper backed by debt, the machine could print endlessly. And finally, Paul Volcker made the system inescapable. When nations couldn't pay, he invented a way to keep them trapped. Through the IMF and the World Bank, debt became a weapon, loans in exchange for obedience. Countries that resisted found their economies frozen, their currencies collapsing, their sovereignty sold. Together, these four architects built more than a financial system. They built an ecosystem that feeds on debt itself. Each layer made the next one stronger. Permanent became global. Global became infinite. Infinite became inescapable. Today, the design runs on autopilot. No one needs to control it directly. Governments borrow, citizens pay, and the flow continues upward, from taxpayers to institutions, from labor to capital, from the many to the few. It's the ultimate machine, self-reinforcing, self-protecting, and impossible to switch off without destroying the world that depends on it. But what if this isn't a failure of policy? What if this is the design working exactly as intended? Because for those who sit at the top, $38 trillion in debt isn't a crisis. It's an income stream. It's the rent the world pays just to keep spinning. Next, let's close with the truth behind that rent, the final realization that debt isn't the problem. Debt is the plan. Every time you hear that a nation is in debt, you're meant to feel fear. You're told that it's a problem, that it's unsustainable, that someone must fix it. But the truth is, there's nothing to fix. Because the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. Debt isn't a mistake in the engine. Debt is the engine. It's the foundation of the money we spend, the markets we trade, and the governments we elect. Every dollar that exists is born from borrowing. And every repayment, every tax, every bailout feeds the same cycle, interest flowing upward to the institutions that hold the world's IOUs. It's a system that rewards those who own and punishes those who work. Every paycheck you earn, every tax you pay, every loan you take helps keep the mechanism alive. It doesn't need kings anymore. It doesn't need conspiracies. It just needs your participation. As long as you keep believing the debt will be paid, the system keeps breathing. William Patterson made debt permanent. Nathan Rothschild made it global. J.P. Morgan made it infinite. Paul Volcker made it inescapable. 4 men, 4 centuries, one unbroken design. A design that turned money into control and turned nations into tenants of their own economies. So when someone says, we owe $38 trillion, remember, it's not a countdown to disaster. It's proof that the system is still running. And those who built it are still collecting rent. If this changed how you see debt, if you finally understand that the crisis isn't accidental but intentional, you're already one step closer to seeing how power truly works. Because they won't teach you this in school. They'll tell you debt is a problem to solve. But the architects knew better. Debt isn't a problem. It's the foundation. And interest is the rent we pay to live in their world.